Have you ever noticed how some people seem to disappear almost overnight after spending months or even years making sure everyone saw every achievement, every celebration, every relationship, and every carefully selected moment of happiness? Their social media falls silent, mutual friends hear less from them, and the person who once seemed determined to occupy every room suddenly becomes almost invisible. At first glance, this disappearance can appear mysterious. Many people interpret it as personal growth, emotional maturity, or an attempt to move on. Yet psychology suggests that the explanation is often more complex. Human behavior is rarely random, especially when it involves individuals whose sense of identity depends heavily on how they are perceived by others. For individuals who display pronounced narcissistic personality traits, external validation functions as a form of psychological regulation. Research in personality psychology indicates that narcissistic characteristics are frequently accompanied by an unstable, rather than genuinely high sense of self-esteem. Although confidence may appear impressive on the surface, it often depends upon a continuous stream of admiration, recognition, attention, or emotional reactions from other people. Psychologists sometimes describe this dependence as reliance on narcissistic supply, a term referring to the emotional reinforcement that temporarily stabilizes an otherwise fragile self-image. Compliments, admiration, envy, fear, attention, and even conflict can all serve this regulatory function, because each response confirms that the individual continues to occupy psychological space in someone else's mind. This distinction is crucial because it changes how we interpret their behavior after a relationship ends. From the outside, it may seem that they are grieving the loss of a partner. In reality, the greater disruption often lies elsewhere. They are confronting the sudden disappearance of a mirror that consistently reflected back the version of themselves they wanted to believe existed. Throughout the relationship, your attention, emotional investment, reassurance, and reactions helped reinforce a carefully maintained identity. Whether those interactions were positive or negative mattered less than the fact that they provided continuous psychological feedback. Once that feedback disappears, the internal structure supporting their self-image can become increasingly unstable. Neuroscience offers an interesting perspective on this process. Human beings naturally construct their identity through social interaction. Brain regions associated with self-referential processing, including areas within the medial prefrontal cortex and the default mode network, are continuously integrating information about how we see ourselves and how we believe others see us. Healthy psychological development gradually reduces dependence on external approval because internal values, personal achievements, emotional regulation, and authentic relationships become stronger sources of stability. However, individuals with pronounced narcissistic features often continue relying disproportionately on external affirmation. Their self-concept remains unusually vulnerable to changes in status, admiration, or interpersonal rejection. This is why the end of a relationship can produce effects that extend far beyond heartbreak. What appears to be confidence may suddenly reveal itself as emotional dependence. The confidence was real only while someone continued reflecting it back. Once the relationship ends, the gap between the idealized self and the actual self becomes more difficult to ignore. Many psychological researchers describe narcissism as involving persistent efforts to defend an ideal self-image against underlying feelings of inadequacy, shame, vulnerability, or insecurity. These uncomfortable emotions rarely disappear. Instead, they remain hidden beneath layers of achievement, appearance, social comparison, and carefully controlled public presentation. When you finally stop reacting, something important changes. Their familiar methods of emotional regulation lose effectiveness. During the relationship, your attempts to explain yourself, defend your intentions, seek understanding, or repair conflict all provided evidence that they still influenced your emotional world. Even disagreements confirmed their psychological significance because your attention remained centered on them. Once you genuinely disengage, however, the feedback loop begins to collapse. Silence offers no emotional information. Emotional independence cannot easily be manipulated because it removes the predictable responses upon which controlling dynamics depend. This is often misunderstood as a simple power struggle, but the underlying mechanisms are considerably more complicated. Control, in many cases, serves as a strategy for regulating anxiety rather than merely dominating another person. Individuals who struggle with unstable self-esteem frequently attempt to reduce uncertainty by controlling relationships, conversations, impressions, and outcomes. When another person's emotional reactions become predictable, the world feels more manageable. Losing that predictability introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty is psychologically uncomfortable for anyone. For individuals with narcissistic traits, it can become profoundly destabilizing because it threatens the very system through which they maintain their identity. Attachment theory provides another valuable lens through which to understand these dynamics. Early childhood experiences shape internal expectations about relationships, trust, emotional safety, and self-worth. Although not every narcissistic individual shares the same developmental history, many researchers believe that inconsistent caregiving, excessive criticism, conditional approval, or unrealistic praise during childhood may contribute to later narcissistic defenses. Rather than developing a secure sense of self, the individual learns to construct an identity based upon performance, superiority, achievement, or admiration. Beneath this construction often lies an enduring fear that the authentic self is somehow inadequate or unworthy of love. Because of this, relationships frequently become less about genuine intimacy and more about emotional regulation. A partner is unconsciously assigned the role of maintaining psychological equilibrium. Validation temporarily quiets self-doubt. Admiration temporarily reduces shame. Attention temporarily reinforces identity. Unfortunately, no relationship can permanently fulfill these functions because human beings inevitably disappoint one another. Every disagreement, every boundary, every independent decision threatens the fragile equilibrium, producing defensive behaviors designed to restore the preferred narrative. This helps explain why many narcissistic individuals seem remarkably invested in controlling how relationships appear rather than how healthy they actually are. Public image can become more important than emotional connection because image directly reinforces identity. A photograph, a compliment, an expensive purchase, or an admired relationship all contribute to maintaining the idealized version of the self. Yet these symbols cannot resolve underlying emotional insecurity. They merely postpone confronting it. Eventually, reality interrupts performance. Every relationship reaches moments where admiration naturally gives way to ordinary human interaction. Healthy intimacy requires vulnerability, accountability, empathy, compromise, and mutual respect. These qualities expose imperfections that grandiosity attempts to conceal. For someone heavily invested in maintaining superiority, genuine intimacy may therefore feel psychologically threatening rather than comforting. Defensiveness increases. Blame becomes easier than reflection. Projection replaces accountability. The partner gradually becomes responsible for emotions the individual struggles to acknowledge within themselves. One of the most significant turning points occurs when you stop participating in this cycle altogether. Instead of arguing, explaining, defending, or seeking closure, you redirect your emotional energy toward your own recovery. From a psychological perspective, this represents a profound shift. Your nervous system gradually becomes less reactive. Stress hormones begin returning toward baseline. Cognitive resources previously consumed by conflict become available for personal growth, healthier relationships, and emotional regulation. What once felt impossible slowly becomes normal. Days pass without wondering what they think. Weeks pass without checking their social media. Eventually, Your sense of identity becomes increasingly independent of the relationship that once dominated your emotional life. Ironically, this quiet transformation often creates the greatest contrast between the two individuals. While one person is rebuilding identity from within, the other may still be searching for stability through external validation. This difference is not about moral superiority or victory. It reflects two fundamentally different strategies for managing emotional insecurity. Internal stability grows through self-awareness, emotional acceptance, meaningful relationships, and realistic self-evaluation. External stability depends upon continuous confirmation from other people, and therefore remains vulnerable to every rejection, criticism, or loss. This explains why silence can carry such different meanings for each person. Your silence may represent healing, acceptance, and emotional independence. Their silence may represent avoidance, image management, or the temporary collapse of familiar coping strategies. Without careful reflection, both forms of silence appear identical from the outside. Yet internally, they are driven by entirely different psychological processes. The greatest misunderstanding is believing that someone with narcissistic traits necessarily spends every day obsessing over the relationship they lost. Human psychology is rarely that simple. More often, they become preoccupied with restoring equilibrium. They seek new sources of validation, new environments where admiration feels possible, new relationships that temporarily reinforce the preferred identity, or new achievements capable of distracting from uncomfortable emotions. None of these efforts necessarily indicate conscious manipulation. Many occur automatically because the underlying psychological system continues operating exactly as it always has. Until genuine self-reflection replaces defensive self-protection, the cycle tends to repeat itself in different relationships, different environments, and different stages of life. For the person who has walked away, however, a different journey begins. Recovery gradually shifts attention away from analyzing another person's behavior and toward understanding one's own emotional patterns. Questions change from, "Why did they do this?" to "Why did I remain despite recognizing the pattern?" This shift represents psychological growth because it returns responsibility to the only person whose behavior can truly be changed: yourself. Healing no longer depends upon receiving apologies, admissions, or explanations. Instead, it develops through strengthening emotional boundaries, rebuilding self-trust, and learning to recognize relationships that encourage authenticity rather than dependency. That transformation is ultimately far more enduring than any temporary satisfaction that might come from watching another person's carefully constructed image begin to crack. As time passes, another psychological process begins to unfold, one that is rarely visible from the outside, yet profoundly influences the emotional trajectory of both individuals. Human memory is not a perfect recording device. It is reconstructive, meaning that every recollection is shaped by current emotions, beliefs, and expectations. During the aftermath of an emotionally intense relationship, the brain naturally attempts to create a coherent narrative that explains what happened. This process involves the hippocampus organizing memories, while the amygdala assigns emotional significance to those experiences. Initially, emotionally charged memories dominate consciousness because the brain interprets unresolved emotional events as information requiring further processing. This is why, in the early stages of separation, people often replay conversations repeatedly, searching for hidden meanings or imagining alternative outcomes. The mind is not trying to torture itself. It is attempting to reduce uncertainty. For someone recovering from a relationship characterized by manipulation, inconsistency, or emotional instability, this period can feel especially confusing. The brain is attempting to reconcile two incompatible realities. One reality contains moments of affection, intimacy, and hope. The other contains repeated experiences of invalidation, unpredictability, criticism, or emotional neglect. Cognitive psychologists describe this tension as cognitive dissonance, a state in which contradictory beliefs or experiences exist simultaneously. Resolving this dissonance requires more than simply remembering what happened. It requires accepting that both realities existed at the same time. The person who occasionally displayed warmth may also have repeatedly engaged in harmful behaviors. Recognizing this complexity allows emotional healing to begin, because the mind no longer needs to force reality into simplistic categories of entirely good or entirely bad. Individuals with pronounced narcissistic traits often struggle with this same complexity, although in a very different way. Their psychological defenses frequently rely upon maintaining highly polarized thinking. Situations become divided into success or failure, admiration or rejection, superiority or humiliation. Nuanced self-evaluation becomes emotionally threatening because it challenges the carefully maintained image of competence and exceptionalism. Instead of integrating both strengths and weaknesses into a balanced identity, defensive mechanisms such as projection, rationalization, denial, and idealization may become increasingly active. These unconscious processes are not deliberate acts of deception in every instance. Rather, they represent automatic attempts by the mind to protect itself from overwhelming feelings of shame or inadequacy. Among these defenses, projection is particularly significant. Rather than consciously acknowledging uncomfortable qualities within themselves, individuals may attribute those characteristics to someone else. Responsibility shifts outward, because accepting internal responsibility would threaten the stability of the self-image they have worked so hard to maintain. This explains why accusations sometimes appear disconnected from observable reality. The accusations are less about objective facts than about internal emotional conflicts being externalized. Understanding this psychological mechanism does not excuse harmful behavior, but it can reduce the tendency to personalize every criticism that was directed toward you. Another important concept involves emotional regulation. Healthy emotional regulation does not mean suppressing feelings or pretending difficult emotions do not exist. Instead, it involves recognizing emotional states, understanding their origins, tolerating discomfort without impulsive action, and responding thoughtfully rather than reactively. Individuals with secure emotional regulation gradually develop these abilities throughout childhood and adulthood. When emotional regulation remains underdeveloped, however, external circumstances become responsible for maintaining internal stability. Relationships become coping mechanisms rather than mutual partnerships. Success temporarily eliminates insecurity. Admiration temporarily reduces self-doubt. Conflict temporarily restores feelings of significance. Unfortunately, because these sources of regulation originate outside the individual, they remain inherently unstable. This instability often produces a cycle that repeats across multiple relationships. Initially, novelty creates excitement and optimism. The new relationship provides admiration, validation, attention, and emotional intensity. Over time, however, ordinary human differences emerge. The partner develops independent opinions, establishes personal boundaries, or simply becomes familiar rather than idealized. At this point, disappointment begins replacing idealization. Instead of adapting through communication and mutual growth, defensive patterns may reactivate. Criticism becomes more frequent. Emotional distance increases. Responsibility shifts toward the partner. Eventually, the relationship begins reflecting many of the same dynamics that characterized previous relationships, even though the individuals involved are entirely different. The environment changes, yet the underlying psychological strategies remain remarkably consistent. Meanwhile, the person who has left the relationship undergoes a very different neurological process. At first, separation often resembles withdrawal. Functional brain imaging studies suggest that romantic rejection activates many of the same neural systems involved in physical pain and addiction. Dopamine pathways previously associated with emotional closeness continue expecting familiar rewards, while stress hormones remain elevated because the nervous system interprets the separation as a significant threat. This explains why logical understanding alone rarely eliminates emotional pain. The brain requires time to reorganize patterns that have developed through repeated emotional experiences. Gradually, however, neuroplasticity begins working in your favor. The brain continuously modifies its connections based upon repeated experiences. Every day spent maintaining healthy boundaries strengthens new patterns of emotional regulation. Every decision to resist checking old messages or social media weakens old reinforcement loops. Every meaningful friendship, fulfilling activity, or healthy relationship provides alternative experiences from which the brain can construct a more stable emotional foundation. Recovery, therefore, involves far more than simply forgetting another person. It involves physically strengthening new neural pathways while allowing old emotional associations to diminish through lack of reinforcement. This biological perspective also explains why healing rarely occurs in a straight line. Emotional memories are distributed across multiple neural systems rather than stored in a single location. A familiar song, location, smell, or unexpected anniversary may temporarily reactivate old emotional networks even after months of apparent progress. Experiencing these moments does not indicate failure. They simply reflect the remarkable efficiency with which the human brain associates emotional experiences with environmental cues. As new experiences accumulate, these temporary activations gradually lose intensity because the memories become integrated into a much larger autobiographical narrative instead of dominating present awareness. One of the most profound changes occurs when your identity gradually becomes less organized around the relationship itself. During emotionally consuming relationships, attention narrows considerably. Decisions become increasingly influenced by anticipating another person's reactions. Emotional energy becomes invested in predicting moods, preventing conflict, or maintaining temporary periods of harmony. Psychologists sometimes describe this narrowing of attention as cognitive preoccupation. It reduces mental resources available for creativity, personal goals, friendships, learning, and self-development. Once the relationship ends, these resources slowly become available again. Interests that once seemed unimportant regain significance. Curiosity returns. Long-term planning becomes possible. Emotional energy shifts from survival toward growth. At the same time, individuals who remain dependent upon external validation often continue investing enormous psychological effort into impression management. Impression management is a normal part of human social interaction. Everyone adjusts behavior somewhat depending upon context. Problems arise when maintaining appearance becomes more important than experiencing authenticity. Considerable mental energy is devoted to predicting how others will interpret every action, every success, every failure, and every relationship. Instead of asking, "Is this meaningful?" the question gradually becomes, "How will this make me appear?" This shift can produce chronic psychological exhaustion because sustaining an idealized public identity requires constant vigilance. Interestingly, long-term psychological well-being consistently correlates more strongly with authenticity than with admiration. Research on subjective well-being suggests that individuals who experience congruence between their internal values and external behavior report greater life satisfaction, stronger relationships, and lower levels of chronic stress. Authenticity allows emotional experiences to be processed rather than hidden. Mistakes become opportunities for learning instead of threats to identity. Criticism becomes information rather than humiliation. Success becomes satisfying without needing to establish superiority over others. These qualities may appear less dramatic than grandiosity, yet they produce a far more resilient psychological foundation. Eventually, a subtle but transformative realization emerges. You stop measuring your progress according to whether the other person has changed. Their choices, relationships, successes, or failures no longer determine your emotional state. Instead, your attention shifts toward questions that genuinely influence your future. Are your relationships healthier than before? Do you trust your own judgment more than you once did? Have your boundaries become clearer? Are you more comfortable expressing needs without fear of abandonment? These questions signal that your recovery has moved beyond the relationship itself and toward a broader reconstruction of identity. This stage is especially significant because it marks the transition from simply escaping emotional pain to actively building psychological resilience. The relationship gradually becomes one chapter within a much larger life story, rather than the defining event around which every future experience revolves. As genuine recovery progresses, the focus gradually shifts away from understanding the psychology of the other person and toward understanding the remarkable adaptability of the human mind itself. One of the greatest misconceptions after leaving a psychologically unhealthy relationship is the belief that healing means forgetting everything that happened. In reality, the healthiest form of recovery rarely involves erasing the past. Instead, it involves integrating the experience into a broader understanding of yourself, your values, and your future relationships. Clinical psychologists often describe this process as narrative integration, the gradual construction of a coherent life story in which painful experiences are acknowledged without becoming the defining feature of one's identity. Instead of repeatedly asking why another person behaved the way they did, the more transformative question becomes what this experience revealed about your own emotional needs, personal boundaries, and capacity for growth. This shift is more significant than it may initially appear because the human brain naturally seeks closure. Uncertainty activates neural circuits associated with vigilance and threat detection, encouraging the mind to search endlessly for explanations. Unfortunately, some relationships never provide satisfying answers. Waiting for complete understanding may therefore become another form of emotional attachment. Many individuals spend years believing they need one final conversation, one sincere apology, or one admission of responsibility before they can finally move forward. Yet research on emotional resilience consistently suggests that closure is more often created internally than received externally. Acceptance develops not because every question has been answered, but because the unanswered questions gradually lose their emotional urgency. For individuals who rely heavily on narcissistic defenses, this internal shift can be especially difficult to comprehend. Their understanding of relationships often remains closely connected to influence and perception. If another person is no longer reacting, defending themselves, seeking validation, or attempting reconciliation, the familiar psychological framework begins to lose coherence. The absence of emotional feedback creates uncertainty because it removes the information previously used to evaluate personal significance. In many cases, this uncertainty stimulates renewed efforts to regain some form of psychological confirmation. Sometimes this appears as indirect communication, unexpected contact after long periods of silence, carefully timed public displays of success, or subtle attempts to determine whether emotional influence still exists. These behaviors are frequently interpreted as evidence of love or regret, yet they may instead reflect the mind's attempt to reduce uncertainty and restore a familiar emotional equilibrium. Behavioral psychology helps explain why these patterns can become remarkably persistent. Human behavior is strongly influenced by reinforcement. When a particular action consistently produces a rewarding outcome, the likelihood of repeating that behavior increases. Throughout the relationship, emotional reactions may have unintentionally reinforced cycles of conflict and reconciliation. Every response, whether positive or negative, confirmed that the emotional connection remained active. Once those predictable responses disappear, the individual may initially increase efforts to reestablish them. Behavioral scientists sometimes refer to this phenomenon as an extinction burst, a temporary increase in previously reinforced behaviors after the expected reward is removed. Although commonly discussed in learning theory, similar principles often help explain recurring interpersonal patterns. Importantly, the increase in behavior does not necessarily indicate deeper affection. It often reflects the temporary disruption of an established reinforcement system. Understanding this distinction protects people from misinterpreting renewed attention as meaningful change. Lasting psychological change is rarely demonstrated through isolated emotional gestures. Instead, it is reflected in consistent patterns of accountability, empathy, emotional regulation, and respect for boundaries maintained over long periods of time. Sustainable change requires self-awareness, willingness to tolerate discomfort, and genuine responsibility for one's own behavior. These qualities develop gradually through deliberate psychological work, rather than through sudden emotional realizations following the loss of a relationship. At the same time, your own nervous system continues adapting to an increasingly stable emotional environment. Chronic stress produces measurable physiological effects throughout the body. Elevated cortisol levels, disrupted sleep, impaired concentration, heightened vigilance, and increased emotional reactivity often accompany prolonged interpersonal stress. As emotional safety returns, these systems slowly begin rebalancing themselves. Sleep improves. Concentration becomes easier. Decision-making becomes clearer because cognitive resources are no longer devoted primarily to anticipating conflict or managing emotional unpredictability. Even physical health frequently benefits as chronic activation of the stress response gradually decreases. This restoration extends beyond biology into personal identity. During psychologically unhealthy relationships, people often begin abandoning parts of themselves without fully realizing it. Hobbies disappear. Friendships become neglected. Career ambitions are postponed. Opinions remain unspoken to avoid unnecessary conflict. Personal preferences become increasingly shaped by another person's emotional reactions rather than genuine desire. Over time, this gradual narrowing of identity creates the painful illusion that the relationship defined who you were. Yet once emotional stability returns, forgotten aspects of yourself begin re-emerging. Interests that once seemed insignificant become meaningful again. Curiosity returns naturally. Creative thinking expands because the mind is no longer occupied with constant emotional monitoring. These changes are not signs that you have become a different person. Rather, they represent the gradual return of capacities that had been overshadowed by prolonged psychological stress. Perhaps the most profound transformation involves self-trust. Healthy relationships are built upon mutual trust, but they also require confidence in one's own perceptions. Manipulative dynamics often undermine this confidence by encouraging repeated self-doubt. Individuals begin questioning their memories, emotional reactions, and personal judgments. Over time, they may rely increasingly upon another person's interpretation of reality instead of their own observations. Rebuilding self-trust, therefore, becomes one of the most important components of recovery. This process develops gradually through repeated experiences of making decisions, observing outcomes, learning from mistakes, and recognizing that personal perceptions are generally more reliable than previously believed. Each successful experience strengthens confidence that future challenges can also be navigated without surrendering personal judgment. Ironically, this renewed self-trust often produces something that appears remarkably ordinary yet is psychologically extraordinary. Life becomes quieter. Emotional highs become less intoxicating, but emotional lows become far less devastating. Relationships begin feeling predictable rather than chaotic. Disagreements become opportunities for communication instead of threats to personal worth. Peace gradually replaces intensity. For individuals accustomed to emotional turbulence, this stability may initially seem unfamiliar, even boring. Yet research consistently demonstrates that long-term relationship satisfaction depends far more upon emotional security, mutual respect, responsiveness, and trust than upon dramatic emotional fluctuations. What once seemed exciting is gradually recognized as exhausting, while what once seemed ordinary becomes deeply fulfilling. From the perspective of the individual who continues relying on external validation, however, the cycle often persists. New achievements provide temporary confidence before requiring even greater achievements. New admiration fades as familiarity develops. New relationships eventually encounter the same challenges that previous relationships faced because the underlying patterns of emotional regulation remain largely unchanged. The external circumstances continue changing while the internal psychological architecture remains fundamentally similar. This creates the illusion of constant movement without corresponding personal development. Different cities, careers, partners, or social circles may temporarily disguise the repetition, but the emotional dynamics often reappear with remarkable consistency. Eventually, time reveals the most important distinction between genuine growth and psychological performance. Performance depends upon maintaining appearances despite internal instability. Growth depends upon gradually reducing the gap between who you appear to be and who you actually are. One requires constant maintenance because it is sustained from the outside. The other becomes increasingly effortless because it is constructed from within. As this difference becomes clearer, another person's silence, activity, success, or disappearance loses much of its emotional significance. Their life continues according to the choices they make, while yours increasingly reflects the values, boundaries, and emotional resilience you have intentionally cultivated. That is the point at which the relationship finally assumes its proper place in your history. It remains important because it taught difficult lessons, but it no longer determines your future. Instead of carrying the emotional weight of what happened, you carry the wisdom gained from surviving it, understanding it, and ultimately allowing it to transform you into someone who no longer depends upon another person's approval to recognize your own worth. Ultimately, the greatest reversal does not occur when the other person experiences disappointment, isolation, or the consequences of their own behavior. Those outcomes, while sometimes inevitable, are not the true measure of healing. The most meaningful transformation occurs when their psychological state is no longer the center of your emotional universe. This distinction may seem subtle, yet it marks the difference between remaining psychologically connected to the relationship and becoming genuinely free from it. As long as your emotional well-being depends on whether they regret losing you, whether they have changed, or whether they eventually recognize the harm they caused, a portion of your psychological energy remains invested in their internal world. Freedom begins only when your attention fully returns to your own life. Modern psychological research increasingly emphasizes that resilience is not the absence of suffering, but the ability to adapt constructively after adversity. Resilience develops through repeated experiences of confronting uncertainty, tolerating emotional discomfort, and gradually rebuilding confidence in one's own capacity to cope with future challenges. This process strengthens what psychologists describe as psychological flexibility, the ability to adjust thoughts and behaviors according to changing circumstances, rather than remaining trapped in rigid emotional patterns. Individuals who develop psychological flexibility generally experience greater emotional stability because they no longer require life to unfold exactly as expected before feeling secure. They learn that disappointment, rejection, uncertainty, and loss, while painful, are survivable experiences rather than permanent definitions of identity. This realization often changes how previous relationships are remembered. Instead of viewing the experience solely through the lens of betrayal or injustice, many people eventually recognize the deeper lessons hidden beneath the pain. They become more attentive to early warning signs that were once dismissed. They notice patterns of excessive charm followed by subtle control, grand promises unsupported by consistent behavior, or repeated attempts to shift responsibility whenever conflict arises. None of these observations produce bitterness when processed in a healthy way. Instead, they become practical knowledge that informs future decisions. Wisdom is rarely the product of comfort alone. More often, it emerges through carefully examining difficult experiences until they reveal something valuable about human nature and about ourselves. One of the most important lessons concerns the difference between confidence and emotional maturity. These qualities are frequently confused because they sometimes appear similar on the surface. Confidence may be expressed through certainty, charisma, ambition, or persuasive communication. Emotional maturity, however, reveals itself differently. It appears through accountability, empathy, patience, emotional regulation, and the willingness to acknowledge mistakes without experiencing them as catastrophic threats to personal worth. Truly mature individuals do not need to appear flawless because their identity does not depend upon perfection. They can apologize sincerely without feeling diminished. They can receive constructive criticism without interpreting it as humiliation. They can celebrate another person's success without perceiving it as a personal defeat. These characteristics create relationships that feel psychologically safe rather than emotionally exhausting. For individuals who remain dependent upon external validation, these qualities often remain difficult to sustain consistently. Maintaining an idealized identity requires continual protection against experiences that threaten it. Every criticism becomes disproportionately painful. Every comparison carries emotional weight. Every perceived rejection risks activating underlying feelings of inadequacy that defensive strategies have long attempted to suppress. Consequently, emotional energy continues flowing toward image management instead of authentic self-development. From the outside, this may resemble confidence, but internally it often requires constant vigilance because the stability being protected originates largely from external approval rather than internal acceptance. As months and years pass, another fascinating psychological phenomenon frequently becomes apparent. The emotional intensity that once seemed overwhelming gradually fades, not because the memories disappear, but because the brain continuously updates their significance. Memory is influenced not only by what happened, but also by who we become afterward. As your life expands through new friendships, meaningful work, healthier relationships, personal achievements, and deeper self-understanding, the emotional importance of the past naturally decreases. The relationship occupies progressively less cognitive space because it represents a smaller proportion of your overall life experience. This process reflects adaptive memory integration rather than forgetting. The experience remains available when recalled, yet it no longer dominates emotional awareness. At this stage, many people notice something surprising. They stop feeling compelled to monitor the other person's life. Curiosity diminishes naturally rather than through forced self-discipline. The urge to search social media, ask mutual acquaintances for updates, or interpret indirect messages gradually disappears because the information no longer serves an emotional purpose. Whether the other person appears successful, enters another relationship, changes careers, or adopts an entirely new lifestyle becomes psychologically neutral. Their choices continue to belong to them, while your emotional equilibrium increasingly depends upon factors that exist entirely within your own control. This shift reflects one of the central principles of long-term psychological well-being, an internal locus of control. Individuals with a strong internal locus of control recognize that while external events influence life, personal meaning and future direction are shaped primarily through one's own responses, decisions, and values. This perspective does not deny hardship or injustice. Rather, it emphasizes personal agency despite difficult circumstances. Instead of waiting for someone else to change before feeling better, emotional energy is directed toward actions that genuinely improve one's own life. Relationships become choices rather than necessities. Self-worth becomes grounded in character rather than comparison. Emotional stability becomes increasingly independent of another person's approval or disapproval. Perhaps this is why genuine healing often appears remarkably quiet. There is rarely a dramatic moment in which everything suddenly makes sense. Instead, freedom accumulates through countless ordinary experiences. One day you realize you have gone weeks without thinking about the relationship. Another day you notice that a familiar place no longer triggers anxiety. Months later you discover yourself laughing freely, making plans confidently, or trusting someone new without constantly expecting betrayal. These moments rarely announce themselves as milestones, yet together they reveal that profound psychological reconstruction has already taken place. Meanwhile, the individual who continues relying primarily upon external validation may remain caught within familiar cycles, not because change is impossible, but because meaningful change requires confronting aspects of the self that defensive strategies have long concealed. Genuine psychological growth demands humility, sustained self-reflection, emotional accountability, and often professional support. These processes are challenging for anyone because they involve acknowledging painful truths about oneself. Without this willingness, external circumstances may continue changing, while fundamental interpersonal patterns remain largely unchanged. Different relationships, environments, and opportunities temporarily alter appearances, but rarely transform underlying psychological structures. In the end, however, the lasting significance of your journey has little to do with diagnosing another person's personality or predicting their future. The most enduring lesson concerns your own capacity for adaptation. Human beings possess extraordinary resilience when provided with safety, self-awareness, supportive relationships, and the opportunity to grow from experience. The pain that once seemed unbearable gradually becomes evidence of strength rather than weakness. The confusion that once dominated your thoughts becomes clarity. The dependence upon external reassurance is gradually replaced by quiet confidence rooted in self-knowledge. This confidence differs fundamentally from performance because it requires no audience. It exists whether anyone notices it or not. That is the quiet conclusion many people eventually reach after leaving psychologically unhealthy relationships. The greatest victory is not witnessing another person's downfall, nor receiving the apology that never arrives, nor proving that you were right all along. The greatest victory is recovering the ability to live without organizing your emotional life around someone else's behavior. It is waking each morning with goals that belong entirely to you, relationships built upon mutual respect rather than emotional dependency, and a sense of identity that no longer fluctuates according to another person's opinions. At that point, the story reaches its natural ending, not because every question has been answered, but because the questions themselves have lost the power to determine how you live. Your future is no longer written by the dynamics you escaped. It is shaped by the awareness, resilience, and emotional maturity you developed because you chose to move beyond them.